There is someone who has opened your contact page today. Not yesterday, not a week ago, today. They typed something, then deleted it, then sat in silence staring at the blank space where their words used to be, wondering whether you would answer, wondering whether you would remember, wondering whether you already know what they've been hiding. You haven't heard from them in a while. Maybe it's been weeks, maybe months. Maybe the silence between you has stretched so long, it started to feel like a wall. But here's what you don't realize. That wall was never built by accident. It was built deliberately, carefully, brick by brick, by someone who is terrified of what happens the moment you see through it. This isn't a coincidence. This isn't random timing. This is psychology. Because when people go quiet, when someone who used to be present in your life suddenly creates distance without explanation, most people assume indifference. Most people assume that silence means they've moved on, that they no longer care, that you simply didn't matter enough. But that is almost never the truth. Silence, in most cases, is not the absence of feeling. It is the presence of fear. And the person thinking about contacting you right now, they are not indifferent. They are the opposite of indifferent. They are drowning in something they cannot name out loud. And the closer they get to reaching out to you, the more terrified they become. Not because they don't want to talk to you, but because they are afraid of what that conversation will eventually uncover. Stay with me. Because what I'm about to show you is not what you think this is about. Let me tell you something about the way certain people operate in relationships. Whether those relationships are romantic, platonic, familial, or somewhere in between. There is a particular kind of person who moves through the world presenting one version of themselves while concealing another. Not in a dramatic, calculated villain way. In a quiet, deeply human way. The kind of concealment that starts small, a half-truth here, an omission there, until over time, the distance between who they actually are and who they've allowed you to see becomes something they cannot cross without consequences. Psychologists have studied this pattern extensively. They call it self-concealment. The deliberate hiding of personally distressing or negative information. And what the research consistently shows is that the act of hiding something doesn't neutralize it. It amplifies it. Every day that a person carries a concealed truth, the psychological weight of that truth grows heavier. The anxiety compounds. The guilt calcifies into something harder. Something that makes authentic connection feel dangerous rather than desirable. This is the architecture of their avoidance. They are not distant from you because they've forgotten you. They are distant because being close to you is, for them, a form of psychological exposure. And exposure, for someone carrying something hidden, feels like annihilation. Think about the last time they went quiet. Think about what was happening in that window, not in your life, but in theirs. Think about whether their silence arrived around the same time as a shift you couldn't quite explain, a slight change in tone, a message that was shorter than usual, a moment where something flickered behind their words that didn't match the surface of what they were saying. You felt it. You may not have named it, but you felt it. That moment you felt, that was the moment they decided the distance was safer than the truth. Here is where I need you to slow down, because this part is important. What this person is hiding is not necessarily something cruel.
It is not necessarily betrayal in the dramatic sense. Not always an affair. Not always a lie constructed with malice. Sometimes, and more often than people realize, what someone is hiding is something far more interior than that. They are hiding the version of themselves they believe you cannot accept. There is a fear that lives inside certain people, a fear so foundational it shapes every significant relationship they enter. The fear that if you truly knew them, if you saw past the composed surface into the complicated, contradictory, sometimes broken interior, you would leave. Or worse, you would stay but look at them differently. You would no longer hold them in the regard that, whether they've admitted it to themselves or not, they have come to depend on. Psychologists call this the imposter phenomenon in relationships. The feeling that one's emotional positioning in someone else's life is built on an incomplete picture. That you are valued for a curated version of yourself rather than the full, unedited one. And the devastating logic of this fear is that the more someone values your presence in their life, the more terrifying the prospect of full transparency becomes. Because the stakes get higher as the connection deepens. This person is about to contact you not despite their fear, but because their fear has reached a saturation point. Because the cost of continued silence has finally started to exceed the cost of the risk. Because carrying this weight alone has become more exhausting than the terrifying prospect of being truly known. But they haven't sent the message yet, because they're still calculating. They're still running the same psychological equation they've been running for weeks or months, trying to determine whether you are safe. Not physically safe, psychologically safe. Whether you are the kind of person who can receive a complicated truth without dismantling the relationship around it. And here's what you don't realize. The fact that they keep coming back to the edge of contacting you. The fact that they haven't simply walked away and chosen permanent silence tells you something profound about how they see you. You represent something to them that they cannot find elsewhere. A quality of presence, of understanding, of depth that they've measured against every other person in their life and found irreplaceable. They are terrified of you, and they cannot stop thinking about you. Both things are true simultaneously. There is a specific psychological state that researchers have begun to examine with greater precision. The state of composed but unsent communication. The drafted text that never gets delivered. The email written at 2 a.m. and deleted by dawn. This is not passive behavior. It is one of the most psychologically active states a human being can occupy. When someone drafts a message to you and doesn't send it, they are engaged in an internal rehearsal of extraordinary complexity. They are simultaneously imagining your response, every possible version of it, and measuring their own emotional capacity to survive each outcome. They are rehearsing vulnerability in a controlled environment, testing the idea of honesty without yet paying its full price. And every time they get close and pull back, the barrier doesn't get smaller. It gets larger. Because now, they are not only managing the original fear of disclosure, they are managing the accumulated weight of every moment they chose silence over honesty. Every deleted message, every conversation they redirected when it moved too close to the truth. Every time they presented the composed version of themselves when the complicated version was pushing to be acknowledged. This is what psychologists describe as the snowball effect of self-concealment. The longer something is hidden, the more significant the act of revealing it becomes.
Not necessarily because the truth itself grows more dramatic, but because the history of its concealment has given it an outsized emotional weight. What might have been a relatively honest conversation 6 months ago has, through sustained avoidance, transformed into something that feels monumental. Something they have rehearsed so many times in isolation that it has acquired the dimensions of a confession rather than simply a conversation. This is why they're terrified. Not necessarily of the truth itself, but of the ceremony that silence has forced upon it. But here's what you don't realize. While they have been constructing this fear, while they have been calculating and retreating and drafting and deleting, they have also been watching you carefully. The way a person watches someone they are trying to understand more deeply than surface interaction permits. They have been paying attention to how you respond when other people make themselves vulnerable around you. They have been listening to the way you speak about people who've disappointed you, whether your language is merciless or measured, whether you reduce people to their worst moments or hold complexity with something approaching grace. They have been studying whether you are safe, and they have found evidence that you might be. Because if they hadn't, they wouldn't still be on the edge of this. They would have made peace with the distance and moved permanently into it. People who have decided that someone is fundamentally unsafe don't hover at the threshold of a conversation for months. They exit cleanly, deliberately, without the kind of lingering that this person has chosen. Their lingering is a form of faith that they haven't yet been able to articulate out loud. There is also something else happening beneath the surface of their calculation, something they're less consciously aware of. A part of them understands, perhaps better than they understand it cognitively, that the version of themselves they've been presenting is not sustainable. That relationships built on curated self-presentation eventually collapse under the weight of their own artifice. That the only architecture capable of bearing real intimacy is the architecture of genuine truth. Part of them wants to be caught. Not in a destructive sense, in the sense that being known fully, uncomfortably, without the filter of strategic self-presentation is one of the deepest human needs that exists. And they've been starving that need for a very long time. Now I need to take you somewhere deeper. Because what I've described so far, the fear, the concealment, the calculated distance, is real. But it is the surface layer of something more psychologically intricate than it first appears. The dark truth this person is carrying about themselves is, at its core, not really about you. It predates you. It predates every relationship they've moved through with this same pattern of revelation withheld, of intimacy approached and retreated from at the critical moment. What they are carrying is a belief about themselves that was handed to them long before you ever entered their life. The belief that they are, in some essential way, too much. Or not enough. Or both simultaneously. Too complicated to be loved without conditions. Too flawed to be held without flinching. Too human in the most inconvenient ways to deserve the kind of regard that doesn't come with an asterisk. This belief was not formed in a single moment. It was formed over years of receiving love that felt conditional, of learning, sometimes through explicit messages and sometimes through silence far more instructive than words, that certain parts of themselves were unwelcome. That approval was available, but only for the acceptable version. Only for the parts that could be presented without embarrassment, without complication, without requiring the people around them to sit with anything difficult. And so they became expert architects of their own acceptability.
They learned precisely which parts of themselves to foreground and which to keep in shadow. They developed the skill of being genuinely charming, genuinely warm, genuinely present, while maintaining a carefully managed interior distance that protected the parts they'd been taught were unacceptable. The person about to contact you is not a manipulator. They are not a villain in the story of your relationship. They are someone who learned at a formative level that full disclosure was dangerous, that being truly known was a risk the people around them had shown them repeatedly was not worth taking. You are one of the first people in a long time, perhaps one of the first people ever, whom they are considering trusting with the unedited version. That is not a small thing. When they finally reach out, and they will, something will shift in the quality of your interaction that you'll be able to feel before you can name it. There will be something different in how they hold the conversation. A kind of careful deliberateness, a tendency to pause before answering in a way that suggests they are not simply retrieving words, but measuring them. A quality of attention that feels more concentrated than usual, as though the stakes of the exchange have been elevated in a way they can feel but haven't yet explained. This is the first sign of approaching threshold, the moment when the weight of what they've been carrying starts to press against the surface of ordinary conversation. Pay attention to that moment, not with the analytical coolness of someone conducting an interrogation, but with the particular quality of presence that allows the other person to feel that whatever they bring into this space will not be weaponized against them. Because here is what will determine whether they finally cross the threshold they've been standing at for so long. Not the words you say, but the quality of safety they feel in your presence. The sense that you are capable of receiving complexity without simplifying it into judgment. That you can hold a truth that doesn't fit neatly without crushing it into a shape that does. This isn't about being permissive. It isn't about abandoning your own standards or pretending that nothing they've hidden could possibly have impacted you. It is about something far more sophisticated than that. It is about creating the conditions under which truth becomes possible. Most relationships never achieve this. Most relationships operate comfortably and sustainably in the shallower registers. Shared interests, mutual warmth, the pleasant choreography of people who enjoy each other's company at a managed depth. And there is nothing wrong with that. But it is a different category of connection than what becomes available when two people agree, consciously or not, to go below the surface. You and this person are at the entrance to that lower level. Whether you descend into it together depends on what happens in the conversation that is coming. Here is where this observation turns its attention toward you. Because you have been watching this silence with your own interior monologue running. You have been constructing your own interpretation of their distance. And if you are honest with yourself, that interpretation has not been neutral. It has been colored by your own history, your own architecture of expectation, your own understanding of what it means when someone you care about creates space between you without explanation. And what that interpretation probably contains, beneath whatever surface reasoning you've applied to it, is a question about your own worth. Whether you were enough. Whether you said something that created the distance. Whether the version of yourself you presented was the version they needed, and you somehow failed to deliver it. This is what makes relational silence so psychologically destabilizing. It is not simply the absence of contact. It is the vacuum that absence creates. A vacuum that the mind, being unable to tolerate emptiness, immediately fills with the most anxiety-producing possibilities it can generate. You have been carrying this too.
And perhaps you haven't named it as such. Perhaps you've intellectualized it, rationalized it, filed it under their problem or their loss,
or whatever framework allowed you to keep moving without examining what the silence actually activated in you. But somewhere beneath the surface of that management, there is something unresolved. A question that hasn't been answered. A door that hasn't been opened. And here's the thing no one tells you about that unresolved space. It isn't weakness. It isn't dysfunction. It is the evidence of genuine connection. Because only things that genuinely matter leave marks when they go quiet. Only relationships with real depth create the kind of absence that has weight to it. The silence between you has weight. That means the connection had substance. This isn't motivation. This is observation. What is happening right now, the hovering, the approaching, the almost contact, is not a romantic cliché. It is not a plot device. It is one of the most clinically documented phenomena in the psychology of close relationships. The threshold phenomenon. The moment at which a person who has maintained protective distance finally approaches the point where continued distance requires more energy than the risk of proximity. When someone reaches this threshold, several things are simultaneously true. They have exhausted the alternative. The option of simply maintaining distance without resolution has become psychologically untenable. The internal cost of carrying the concealment forward has exceeded their capacity to continue bearing it alone. They have made a judgment about you. Not a conscious, deliberated judgment necessarily, but a deep structure assessment that you are among the people, possibly the only person, with whom resolution feels more possible than impossible. And they are afraid in a way that is indistinguishable neurologically from the fear that precedes transformation. Because all genuine change, all movement from one state of being to a more honest one, is preceded by a fear response. The amygdala does not differentiate between threats to physical safety and threats to psychological identity. Both register as danger. Both produce the same cascade of avoidance impulse. The person reaching out to you is fighting their own neurology. They are overriding a deeply wired protective response in favor of something they cannot yet fully articulate, but that they know, at a level below language, is necessary. That is an act of courage. Even if it doesn't look like courage from the outside. Even if it arrives as a tentative message, careful and measured, giving nothing away that they don't have to give away yet. Beneath the surface of that message will be an extraordinary amount of work. Years of conditioning being consciously refused. A self-protective pattern being deliberately interrupted. The first small word of a conversation they've been trying to have with you for far longer than you know. There is a version of the future in which this conversation never fully happens, in which they reach out, you respond, and the exchange remains safely on the surface. Two people circling the gravity of something unspoken without ever entering it. In which the fear wins one more time and the distance reconfigures itself into something more socially acceptable. Regular contact, maintained carefully at a depth that keeps the concealment intact. That version of the future is possible. It is, statistically, the more common outcome. But there is another version. A version in which the conversation that is coming becomes the one that rewrites the entire context of your relationship. In which the truth they've been carrying finally meets the safety you are capable of offering, and something entirely new becomes possible between you. Not because the truth is comfortable, not because what they've hidden is easy to receive or simple to integrate, but because the alternative, the continued management of a connection that has never been allowed to breathe fully, is finally recognized by both of you
as a form of poverty dressed in the clothing of stability. Genuine relationships, the ones that endure, the ones that matter, the ones that become the architecture of a life rather than simply its decoration, are not built on the presentation of acceptable selves. They are built in the moments when the unacceptable self is offered up and received without flinching. When someone shows you the parts of themselves they've been most ashamed of, and you do not look away. Those moments are rare. They do not arrive on schedule. They cannot be manufactured or strategically engineered. They emerge slowly and almost involuntarily from the accumulated evidence that safety is real, that you are real, that what exists between you is strong enough to hold what is true rather than only what is comfortable. The person who is about to contact you has been building toward this moment for longer than either of you realizes. And you, perhaps without knowing it, perhaps without ever consciously choosing it, have been the kind of presence that made this moment possible. Your steadiness, your depth, the quality in you that this person has measured against everyone else and found singular. The thing in you that made the risk finally seem worth taking. You will not be able to force this. You will not be able to accelerate it or manage it toward your preferred outcome. What you can do is something harder and more powerful than either of those things. You can be exactly who you have always been when it matters most. You can receive whatever arrives, tentative, fragmented, imperfect, with the quality of presence that made this person choose you in the first place. You can hold the space for truth without demanding a particular shape of it. And you can trust that whatever emerges from this conversation, whatever the dark truth turns out to be, you are not in danger of it. You are not someone who is undone by complexity. You are not someone who requires other people to be perfect in order to be worthy. You already knew that about yourself. Now, slowly, terrified, on the edge of the most honest version of themselves they've allowed anyone to see, this person is beginning to know it too. The message is almost written. The silence is about to break. What comes after it is not the end of something. It is the beginning of something that could only ever have started here, in the aftermath of fear, on the other side of concealment, in the strange and quietly sacred space where two people finally stop performing and simply tell the truth. That space is waiting, and you have always been ready for it.